I flew 16 hours from Tokyo to Atlanta for my brother's wedding, but my parents turned me away at the velvet ropes. You do not belong here, they told me. I left without shedding a single tear. 2 days later, my mother called in a panic. The wedding bill was $125,000, and the venue locked the doors until it was paid. "We need your money," she screamed. I laughed, reminded her she said I wasn't family, and hung up. Their absolute nightmare had just begun. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, the one whose success was ignored while the golden child was worshipped, hit the like button and subscribe. You will want to hear exactly how I dismantled their fake empire piece by piece. The humidity of a Georgia summer afternoon hit me the second I stepped out of the Uber Black. The Chateau Estate stood before me, a sprawling monument to Southern wealth, with its towering white columns and perfectly manicured magnolia trees. It was the premier wedding venue in Buckhead, the kind of place that required a waiting list and a bank account with commas just to secure a weekend date. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal gray Tom Ford suit, the fabric light against the sweltering heat, and adjusted my grip on my leather tote. I was exhausted. The flight from Japan had been grueling, filled with endless conference calls and quarterly projections for my private equity firm. But I had made it. I had shown up for my younger brother Malcolm. I barely made it past the iron gates before they intercepted me. My mother Patricia and my father Calvin materialized from the garden pathway like two sentinels guarding a fortress. Patricia wore a custom silk gown that screamed new money, trying to masquerade as old wealth. Calvin stood beside her in a tailored tuxedo, his chest puffed out, scanning the perimeter to ensure none of his fraternity brothers from his elite social club were watching. Patricia did not offer a hug. She did not offer a smile. Her eyes immediately darted to my hair. I wore it in a full natural afro, perfectly shaped, but to my mother, anything that did not mimic European beauty standards was an act of rebellion. "What are you doing here, Danielle?" Patricia asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Her gaze swept over my suit, her lips curling in disgust. "You could not even bother to dress up for your brother's wedding. You look like you just stepped out of a cubicle. That suit is completely inappropriate for a Gatsby-themed event." I took a slow breath, grounding myself. "I flew 16 hours to be here, Mom. I am here to celebrate Malcolm." "Do not play the devoted sister with me," Patricia hissed, taking a step closer. Her heavy perfume mixed cloyingly with the scent of the magnolias. "I told you 3 weeks ago that we needed you to wire $30,000 to cover the remaining balance for the imported floral arrangements. You ignored my emails. You ignored my texts. And now you think you can just waltz in here and drink our champagne and eat our food." I looked at her, truly amazed by the audacity. "You wanted me to pay $30,000 for flowers for a wedding I had no part in planning. A wedding you specifically told me I was not needed for until the vendor bills started piling up." Calvin stepped forward, his face hardening into the stern, authoritative mask he had used to intimidate me my entire childhood. "Keep your voice down, Danielle. We have important people inside. The mayor is here. Half of the country club board is sitting in the front row. We are not having one of your disruptive episodes today. We asked you for a simple contribution to the family. Malcolm is your brother. It is your duty to help him start his new life." Duty. I repeated the word, tasting bitter on my tongue. Where was his duty when I was working 3 jobs to put myself through college? Patricia rolled her eyes, a gesture of pure disdain. Not this again. Always playing the victim. "We made the financial choices that made the most sense for the family's image. Malcolm had potential. He needed the Ivy League pedigree to secure his future. You were always so stubborn, so unpolished. You never cared about fitting into the right circles. Look at you now. 35 years old, still single, working some mid-level office job in New York, and refusing to help your own flesh and blood." The colorism and elitism in her words were not new, but they still carried a sting. In my parents' eyes, my dark skin and quiet, observant nature meant I was not a viable asset for their social climbing ambitions. Malcolm, with his lighter complexion and loud charisma, was the golden ticket. They had poured every resource they had into him, draining their accounts to ensure he belonged to the right clubs, drove the right cars, and mingled with the right people. And now those right people included his bride Harper. As if summoned by the tension, Malcolm and Harper appeared from the side terrace. Harper looked like a porcelain doll dipped in artificial wealth. She wore a massive glittering tiara and a gown that looked heavy and uncomfortable. Malcolm trailed slightly behind her, looking anxious but puffing his chest out as soon as he saw me. Danielle Harper said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness, "You actually came. I thought you would be too embarrassed after the bridal shower." I stared at her. At her bridal shower 2 months prior, I had worn a vintage Chanel dress. Harper, whose family specialized in faking a luxurious lifestyle on maxed-out credit cards, had loudly mocked it as a cheap thrift store find in front of all her bridesmaids. I had not defended myself. I had simply left early, leaving my expensive gift on the table. "My relatives are inside." Harper continued adjusting her diamond necklace. "They are very traditional, very old money. I really do not want them feeling uncomfortable. You always bring this heavy, serious energy to every room you enter. You are just an office worker, Danielle. You do not understand how these high society events operate." I shifted my gaze to my brother. "Is this how it is, Malcolm? You are going to stand there and let her speak to me like that?" Malcolm crossed his arms, leaning into his role as the wealthy groom. "Look, Danielle Harper is right. This event is about our image. My business partners are in there. You showing up in a business suit with your hair like that, it just does not fit the aesthetic. You are always so angry, so bitter because you had to take out student loans while I got the full ride. You need to let that go. Go back to your cubicle in New York. You do not belong here." I stood in the sweltering Georgia heat looking at the four of them, my father desperate to maintain a facade of wealth, my mother entirely consumed by social status and colorist prejudices, my brother an arrogant failure pretending to be a mogul, and his bride a woman drowning in debt, but pretending to be royalty. They thought I was struggling. They genuinely believed I was a low-level accountant scraping by in a cramped apartment, bitter over their imagined success. They had never bothered to ask what I actually did in New York, or why I spent so much time in Tokyo and London. They never asked because they never cared. I could have shattered their world right then and there. I could have told them that the Tom Ford suit I was wearing cost more than the catering budget for their entire reception. I could have told them that my private equity firm managed over $4 billion in assets. I could have told Harper that I knew her father Richard was currently dodging calls from collection agencies. But a sniper does not announce their position before taking the shot. I looked at my mother, whose arms were crossed defensively over her chest. I looked at my father, who was actively checking his watch, willing me to disappear. And finally, I looked at Malcolm, the golden child, who had taken everything and earned nothing. "You are absolutely right," I said, my voice eerily calm, completely devoid of the anger they were hoping to provoke. "I do not belong here. I do not fit your image at all." Patricia let out a harsh breath of relief. "Thank God you finally understand. Now be a good girl and leave before the guests see you. We will send you some photos." I turned my back on them and began walking down the gravel driveway toward the exit. I did not run. I did not cry. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who knew exactly how much power she held. "Have a beautiful wedding, Malcolm," I called out over my shoulder without turning around. "I hope you can afford it." I heard Harper scoff in the background. "Typical bitter Danielle," she muttered to my mother. My mother simply shushed her, ushering her back toward the venue to prepare for their grand entrance. I reached the main road just as my Uber Black circled back around. The driver, sensing my mood, held the door open for me in complete silence. The cool leather interior of the car was a stark contrast to the suffocating heat outside. I settled into the back seat, the heavy doors shutting out the sounds of the wedding preparations. I reached into my leather tote and pulled out my iPad. The screen immediately lit up with notifications. Among the endless stream of financial reports and market updates was an urgent encrypted message from David, my chief financial officer at Apex Capital. I opened the secure messaging app. David had written, "Boss, I am monitoring the flagged accounts as you requested. Calvin's primary American Express account just attempted to pre-authorize a charge for $125,000 at the Chateau estate. The venue requires the balance cleared before the reception begins. Are we executing the protocol? A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy, but the cold, calculating smile of a chess player watching their opponent walk directly into a trap. My father had been quietly funneling money into a failing logistics startup run by Malcolm. To cover his tracks and maintain his lavish lifestyle, Calvin had taken out massive lines of credit through a boutique lending firm he thought was independent. He did not know that Apex Capital, my company, had acquired that lending firm a year ago. I owned every single cent of my father's debt. I held the keys to his entire financial existence. My mother had demanded $30,000 for flowers, thinking I was a desperate office worker who owed them tribute. Harper had mocked my clothes. Malcolm had told me to go back to my cubicle. They had turned me away at the gates because I did not fit their illusion. Now it was time to show them reality. I rested my fingers on the glass keyboard of the iPad. The engine of the Maybach purred quietly as the driver pulled away from the estate, leaving my family behind to celebrate their lies. I typed my response to David, my keystrokes deliberate and final. Decline the transaction. Freeze all credit accounts under Calvin's name. Flag them for immediate review due to excessive debt-to-income ratio. Do not authorize a single dollar. I hit send. The message vanished, shooting across the digital atmosphere to trigger a financial avalanche that would strip my family of everything they held dear. They wanted a wedding to impress high society. They wanted to prove they were part of the untouchable elite. Instead, they were about to face the most humiliating, devastating reality check of their lives. I leaned my head against the cool window, watching the trees blur past. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a calendar reminder for a board meeting in Manhattan on Monday. I had billions of dollars to manage. I had a financial empire to run. And in exactly 48 hours, my mother would be calling me, screaming, begging, and crying for the very money she had just told me I was too poor to possess. The game had just begun. Exactly 48 hours later, the dust had settled in Atlanta, but the storm was just brewing in New York. I sat at the edge of my marble kitchen island in my Manhattan penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the skyline. The morning light caught the steam rising from my freshly brewed espresso. Down below, the city was moving at its usual frantic pace, but up here everything was perfectly silent, perfectly controlled. It was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was unfolding nearly 1,000 miles away. I took a slow sip of the dark roast, letting the bitter flavor ground me. My phone rested face down on the cool marble counter. It had been vibrating intermittently since dawn, first just a few isolated buzzes, then a steady, relentless stream of notifications. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who was calling. David, my chief financial officer, had already sent me the morning brief. The traps we set had sprung precisely on schedule. Calvin's primary credit lines had been severed at exactly midnight. The secondary accounts followed an hour later. By the time the sun came up, my family's financial facade had been entirely dismantled. The phone began to ring again. The sharp, piercing tone of my private line shattered the quiet of the penthouse. This time, I let it ring 4 times before I reached out and turned the device over. The caller ID flashed my mother's name, Patricia. I swiped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear without saying a word. The silence on my end was met with heavy, erratic breathing on hers. Danielle, her voice cracked immediately, lacking the polished country club superiority she usually paraded around like a royal crest. Wire the money right now. She did not bother with a greeting or an apology. There was only panic, a raw, desperate panic that made my pulse steady. I took another sip of my espresso, setting the cup down with a soft clink against the saucer. "What money, Mom?" I asked, my voice smooth and untroubled. "Do not play games with me, Danielle." Patricia shrieked, the sound echoing harshly through the speaker. "Your father's cards are declining. Every single one of them. We are at the Chateau estate, and the venue manager is holding Malcolm and Harper hostage. They literally locked their luggage in the bridal suite. They won't let them leave for the airport to catch their flight to the Maldives until the balance is paid in full. $125,000, Danielle. You need to fix this right now. I leaned back in my leather bar stool looking out at the Chrysler building. I let her words hang in the air, allowing her to hear the desperation in her own voice. It was incredible, really. Just 2 days ago, she had stood at the gates of this exact venue, looking at my tailored suit with absolute disgust, telling me I was unfit to ruin her golden boy's perfect day. Now she was demanding my money to save him. You said I wasn't family, I reminded her, my tone conversational as if we were discussing the weather. You told me I didn't fit your image. So why are you calling an outsider to handle a family matter? Call Harper's wealthy father to pay for it. I am sure Richard has a spare $100,000 lying around his estate. A strangled sob escaped my mother's throat. Richard's funds are tied up in investments, she yelled, the lie tumbling out of her mouth as automatically as breathing. He cannot liquidate assets on a Sunday, and the bank is saying there is some sort of freeze on your father's accounts. It is a bank error, a stupid system glitch, but the manager here will not listen. They are threatening to call the police, Danielle. The police. Do you know what that would do to our reputation? If the country club board finds out we had the police called on us over an unpaid bill, we will be ruined. I smiled, staring at my reflection in the dark surface of my coffee. I knew Richard's funds were not tied up in investments. I knew Richard didn't have any funds at all. My firm had done a full background check on Harper's family the moment Malcolm announced the engagement. Richard was drowning in debt, living off extended credit, and keeping up appearances by leasing cars he couldn't afford. He had pushed Harper to marry Malcolm because my parents projected the image of the wealthy black elite. My parents pushed Malcolm to marry Harper because her whiteness and her family's faux old money aesthetic elevated their social standing. It was a marriage built on two empty bank accounts colliding, a house of cards destined to collapse. And I was the wind pulling the structure down. You are going to ruin your brother's life, Patricia screamed, her panic morphing into sudden, vicious anger when she realized I was not rushing to open my checkbook. You selfish brat. After everything we did for you, we gave you a roof over your head, we fed you, we raised you, and this is how you repay us. By abandoning your family in their time of need. You are just a glorified accountant. You have always been jealous of Malcolm. You have always hated that he was meant for bigger things while you sit in a cubicle crunching numbers. I closed my eyes, letting the insult wash over me. A glorified accountant. That was the narrative they had constructed to make themselves feel better about my absence. When I left for New York years ago, driven out by their constant belittling and their refusal to support my education, I stopped updating them on my life. I paid my own way through college. I took the brutal entry-level jobs. I worked 100-hour weeks analyzing market trends, forecasting acquisitions, and building a portfolio from the ground up. I slept on a mattress on the floor for 3 years so I could funnel every spare dollar into investments. When I founded my own firm, I didn't call home to brag. I knew they would only find a way to diminish it, or worse, claim credit for it. So they convinced themselves I was a low-level desk worker, a bitter spinster grinding away at a calculator. Mom, I said, cutting through her tirade. My voice was low, but it carried a weight that made her instantly stop shouting. The cards did not decline because of a bank error. What are you talking about? Patricia breathed, her confusion palpable through the receiver. I stood up from the stool and walked toward the massive glass windows looking down at the streets below. I am talking about your debt, Mom. I am talking about the predatory loans Dad took out to fund Malcolm's failed app 3 years ago. I am talking about the lines of credit you opened to maintain your country club memberships and buy custom silk gowns for weddings you could not afford. The bank did not make a mistake. The cards declined because Apex Capital froze the credit lines due to a critical breach of the debt-to-income ratio. There was a heavy, dead silence on the line. I could hear the faint sound of a siren in the background on her end, but Patricia said nothing. I pressed the phone closer to my ear. You see, Mom? I continued, my voice steady and surgical. I am not a glorified accountant. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Capital. My firm acquired the boutique lending agency Dad has been secretly borrowing from. I own your debt. I own the credit cards in your wallet. And as of midnight, I decided you were a liability. I froze the accounts. Danielle, her voice was barely a whisper, now stripped of all its venom, replaced by a hollow, terrifying realization. What have you done? I gave you exactly what you asked for, I replied. I removed myself from your image. Have a wonderful time explaining the police presence to the country club. I ended the call. I did not block her number. I did not turn off my phone. I simply placed the device back on the marble counter and walked away. My heart rate had not elevated. My hands were perfectly still. I walked into my sprawling master bathroom, turned on the rainfall shower, and let the hot water wash away the lingering tension of the past 48 hours. For the first time in my life, I felt completely untethered from the heavy, suffocating expectations of my family. I had spent 35 years being told I was too dark, too quiet, too serious, and too plain to be of any value to them. I was the scapegoat expected to suffer in silence while Malcolm soaked up the sun. But the scapegoat had quietly built an empire, while the golden child built a fantasy. I took my time getting dressed, pulling on a pair of wide-leg tailored trousers and a simple silk blouse. I poured myself a second cup of espresso and sat on the plush velvet sofa in my living room, turning on the morning financial news. The anchor was discussing market fluctuations, but the words simply washed over me. I was waiting. I knew my mother. I knew my father. And I knew Malcolm. They would not accept defeat over a phone call. They were too deeply entrenched in their own delusions of grandeur to simply roll over and accept that the daughter they discarded held their financial execution switch. They would need a target for their rage. My penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a highly secure building in Tribeca. Access to the private elevator required a keycard that only I and my security team possessed. However, I had specifically instructed the lobby concierge the night before to grant unrestricted access to anyone matching my parents' description should they arrive. I wanted them to come to me. I wanted them to step into my world and see exactly what they had thrown away. 3 hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floors of my living room. I read through 2 acquisition proposals and approved a multi-million-dollar merger for a tech subsidiary. The business of making money did not stop for family drama. Then the soft melodic chime of the private elevator echoed through the massive foyer. The polished steel doors slid open with a quiet hiss. They didn't just walk out, they exploded out of the elevator cab like a volatile storm crashing into a serene harbor. Calvin led the charge, his face a mottled mask of purple rage, his usually immaculate tuxedo wrinkled and stained with sweat. Patricia followed close behind, her custom gown, looking haggard, her perfect hair disheveled from the frantic journey. Malcolm stormed in right next to her, his hands balled into fists. Harper trailed behind him, looking bewildered and furious, dragging her expensive designer travel bag. And bringing up the rear was Harper's father, Richard, his face flushed red with an arrogant fury that only comes from a man used to bullying his way through life. They stormed past the entryway, art past the curated sculptures, and marched directly into the center of my living room. The sheer scale of the penthouse, the panoramic views of the city, the unmistakable quiet luxury of the space seemed to momentarily stun them. Patricia's eyes darted to the vaulted ceilings and the custom chandelier, her jaw dropping a fraction of an inch before she forced it shut. Malcolm looked around the room, a flash of pure, unadulterated envy crossing his features before his face twisted back into a snarl. But Richard broke the silence. He stepped forward, pointing a trembling, aggressive finger directly at my face. He didn't care about the penthouse. He cared about his own wounded pride. The real war had arrived right at my doorstep. The polished steel doors of my private elevator slid open with a soft hiss, and the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse was instantly shattered. They poured into my foyer like a collapsed dam. My father Calvin led the way, his face a mask of purple rage. his usually immaculate tuxedo now wrinkled and smelling faintly of stale champagne and desperation. My mother Patricia was right behind him, her custom silk gown looking absurdly out of place against the minimalist modern lines of my entryway. Malcolm stomped in next, his hands balled into tight fists. Harper trailed him, dragging a designer overnight bag, her face smeared with ruined makeup. And finally, Richard Harper's father pushed his way to the front, his face flushed with the kind of arrogant fury reserved for men who have never been told no in their entire lives. My two private security guards stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, their hands resting casually near their waistbands. I raised a single finger, signaling them to stand down. I wanted this. I had orchestrated this exact moment. Richard did not even wait to fully enter the living room before he started shouting. He pointed a trembling, aggressive finger directly at my face. "Listen here, you little fraud," he barked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I am going to sue you for everything you have. You do not get to hold my daughter hostage on her wedding day. You do not mess with my family, and you certainly do not mess with my money." I remained seated on my leather bar stool at the kitchen island. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply watched him. Richard was a man who relied entirely on the illusion of old money white privilege. He wore a tweed blazer with elbow patches and a vintage Rolex, playing the part of the seasoned aristocrat. But I could see the sweat gathering at his hairline. I could see the slight tremor in his pointing finger. He was not a predator. He was cornered prey. "Sue me with what money, Richard?" I asked, my voice perfectly level and quiet. The contrast between his red face screaming and my absolute stillness made him falter for a fraction of a second. "I have lawyers on retainer who will bury you," he threatened, taking another step forward. "You think because you run some little scam operation in the city that you can humiliate us. I will see you in federal court. I will have you stripped of whatever fake assets you claim to own." I reached out and pulled a thick manila dossier from the stack of documents I had prepared earlier that morning. The dossier had a heavy red stamp on the cover. I slid it slowly across the smooth marble surface of the kitchen island until it stopped exactly in front of where he stood. "Your family old money dried up a decade ago, Richard," I said, watching his eyes drop to the red stamp. "You do not have lawyers on retainer. You have a string of unpaid legal bills from 3 different firms in the Hamptons, all of whom dropped you as a client last spring." Richard's jaw tightened. "What is this garbage?" he muttered, though he made no move to touch the folder. "That is a comprehensive summary of your financial ruin," I explained, leaning forward slightly. "You see, when Malcolm announced he was marrying into the prestigious conservative elite, I had my risk management team do a standard background check. I like to know who is attaching themselves to my family name, however little that name means to me now." Harper stepped forward, her voice shrill. "Dad, what is she talking about?" Richard swallowed hard, keeping his eyes fixed on the marble counter. "She is lying, Harper. She is just trying to deflect from the fact that she is a criminal." I smiled and opened the folder. "Let us review the lies then, shall we?" I flipped to the first page. "Your Porsche Panamera. The one you love to park right in front of the clubhouse is leased. And the holding company that owns that lease was acquired by Apex Capital 6 months ago. You are 4 months behind on payments, Richard. I could have it repossessed while we stand here talking." The color began to drain from Richard's face. Malcolm looked at his new father-in-law, his brow furrowing in confusion. I turned to the next page. "Your membership at the country club, the one my parents were so thrilled to be associated with. It costs $80,000 a year. You have been paying the dues using a series of rotating high-interest credit cards. Those cards were issued by a subsidiary bank that my firm controls. We flagged the accounts for severe delinquency last week." Patricia let out a small, choked gasp. She looked at Richard, then at Harper, her eyes wide with mounting horror. The social currency she thought she had purchased by marrying her son to this white family was evaporating into thin air. "You are $2.5 million in debt, Richard," I said, closing the folder and folding my hands over it. "Your estate in Connecticut has 2 shadow mortgages on it. Your liquid assets amount to less than $12,000. You are completely, utterly broke. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic far below on the Manhattan streets. Richard looked as though all the air had been violently punched out of his lungs. His aggressive posture crumbled and his shoulders sagged. "You pushed Harper to marry Malcolm because you looked at my parents and saw a lifeline." I continued dissecting the reality of their arrangement with surgical precision. "You saw a desperate status-obsessed black family who loved to flash their cash, and you thought they were loaded. You thought Malcolm was the heir to a massive logistics fortune. You traded your daughter to a family you secretly looked down on just to save yourself from bankruptcy." Harper let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She backed away from her father, staring at him as if he were a stranger. "Dad, tell me she is lying. Tell me this is a joke," she pleaded, her voice cracking. Richard could not look at her. He stared at the floor, his silence confirming every single word I had just spoken. "You are broke!" Harper shrieked, her carefully maintained facade of high society elegance shattering completely. "You told me Malcolm's family was liquid. You told me this marriage would secure the trust fund." "There is no trust fund, is there?" Malcolm turned to Harper, his own face twisting into a mask of disgust. "Wait a minute," he said, stepping toward her. "You only married me for money. You told me you loved my ambition. You told me you did not care about the finances." Harper laughed, a bitter, hysterical sound. "Your ambition, Malcolm, please. You are a failed app developer who plays golf on Tuesdays. The only reason I put up with your insufferable mother and your cheap, fake, elite lifestyle was because my father promised me your family had real equity." Patricia lunged forward, her face contorted with rage. "How dare you speak to my son that way, you penniless little tramp? We welcomed you into our home. We paid for your lavish engagement party. You paid for it with credit cards," Harper screamed back at her, pointing a manicured finger at my mother. "Credit cards that apparently belong to your estranged daughter. You people are a joke. You are all just playing dress-up." The living room devolved into absolute chaos. Patricia was screaming at Harper, calling her every name in the book. Harper was screaming at Malcolm, demanding an annulment before the ink on the marriage license could even dry. Richard was shouting at my parents, blaming them for misrepresenting their wealth. Malcolm was yelling at everyone, his fragile ego completely demolished by the revelation that his beautiful trophy bride was nothing more than a desperate gold digger sent by a bankrupt father. I sat in silence, watching them tear each other apart. This was the reality of the people who had judged me my entire life. This was the foundation of their precious family image. It was nothing but lies, debt, and mutual exploitation. They had discarded me because I did not fit into this twisted pageant of fake prosperity. Looking at them now, acting like feral animals fighting over scraps of meat, I had never been more grateful for my exclusion. I reached out and poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the crystal carafe on the island. The gentle fizzing sound was a stark contrast to the shouting match echoing off my walls. "Enough!" a booming voice cut through the chaos. "My father." Calvin stepped into the center of the room, physically pushing Malcolm back and holding a hand up to silence Patricia and Richard. His chest was heaving and the veins in his neck were pulsing visibly against his collar. He looked like a man trying desperately to hold up a collapsing roof with his bare hands. The shouting died down, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and Harper's quiet weeping. Calvin turned his attention back to me, his eyes dark with a furious, desperate authority. He was trying to reclaim his role as the patriarch, the man who always had a solution, the man who commanded respect. "Enough of these lies." Calvin barked, his voice vibrating with forced dominance. "I do not care what kind of petty financial tricks you think you are playing, Danielle. You do not speak to us this way. And Malcolm, do not listen to a single word she says. We do not need her, and we certainly do not need to beg for her money." Calvin adjusted his suit jacket, standing taller as he looked down his nose at Richard. "If your family is bankrupt, Richard, that is your problem. My son does not need to be dragged down by your failures. We have our own wealth. We have our own legacy." He turned back to me, pointing a finger just as Richard had done earlier. You think you have us cornered because of a few frozen credit lines? You think you can disrespect your brother on his wedding week and hold his luggage hostage like some common thug? I will not allow it. I will fix this myself just like I always do. I took a slow sip of the sparkling water, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat. And how exactly are you going to do that, Dad? I asked. I am calling my broker right now, Calvin declared, pulling his phone from his pocket with a dramatic flourish. I will just pull the $500,000 from the family business equity. I will pay off the venue, I will pay for the honeymoon, and I will cut a check to buy out whatever petty debt you claim to own. We are done with you, Danielle. You are no longer part of this family. He stared at me, waiting for my reaction. He expected me to shrink back. He expected me to be intimidated by the mention of the family business, the sacred cow of our lineage. The business was the source of all their pride, the shield they used to deflect any criticism. I set the crystal glass down on the marble counter. The clink sounded like a gavel falling in a silent courtroom. I looked at my father, watching the false bravado mask the deep-seated panic in his eyes. I smiled, a slow, cold smile that reached all the way to my eyes. What business equity, Dad? I asked quietly. The silence in the penthouse was no longer just tense. It was explosive, the kind of silence that pulls the oxygen from the room and leaves everyone suffocating in the aftermath of a catastrophic revelation. Patricia's hand remained clamped over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically between my face. Calvin's horrified expression, and Malcolm's sudden confusion. She had let the mask slip, and in doing so, she had handed me the final piece of the puzzle I had been searching for my entire adult life. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the cool marble counter. My heart beat a slow, measured rhythm against my ribs. I did not blink, I did not raise my voice. I simply let her confession hang in the air, a toxic, heavy truth that could never be unsaid. When my grandmother passed away 15 years ago, I was a sophomore in college. I had loved her fiercely. She was the only person in the family who praised my quiet nature, who bought me books on finance and mathematics, who told me my dark skin was beautiful when my parents constantly urged me to stay out of the sun. When she died, my mother told me she had left nothing behind. She told me the funeral expenses had wiped out her meager savings. Because of that lie, I spent my junior and senior years of college working 3 minimum wage jobs. I took overnight shifts at a data entry firm. I slept in the library. I ate rice and beans for months on end while my friends went on spring break trips. I took out massive predatory student loans that took me a decade of 100-hour work weeks to finally pay off. All the while, Malcolm was living in a luxury off-campus apartment at his Ivy League university, driving a brand new vehicle and pledging a fraternity that cost thousands of dollars a semester. My parents told me they were simply prioritizing the family budget. They told me Malcolm's networking opportunities were a necessary investment. I never knew they had stolen my inheritance to fund his entitlement. So I said, my voice barely above a whisper, slicing through the heavy silence like a razor. You finally admit it. Patricia took a step backward, shaking her head. Her eyes were wide with panic. Danielle, I did not mean. You misunderstood. It was not like that. I walked slowly around the kitchen island, closing the distance between us. The 2 security guards by the door shifted their weight, anticipating a physical altercation, but I waved them off. I did not need physical force. I had something much more devastating. You told me Grandma left nothing. I said, my voice eerily calm, contrasting sharply with the chaotic energy radiating from my mother. You looked me in the eyes at her funeral and told me there was no money. You watched me work myself to the bone. You watched me nearly starve. You watched me beg financial aid officers for extensions. And all the while you had cashed out the life insurance policy she specifically left for my education. You stole from your own mother to pamper your son. Calvin stepped in front of Patricia, trying to play the authoritative patriarch one last time. He squared his shoulders, but the gesture looked pathetic on a man who had just realized he owned absolutely nothing. It was a family decision, Calvin said, his voice loud but lacking its usual conviction. It was an investment. Malcolm had the potential to elevate this family's status. He was going to the Ivy League. He was going to join the right circles. We needed that money to ensure he looked the part. You were just a dark-skinned girl who liked math. You were never going to marry into the right families. You were never going to be the face of our legacy. We made a strategic choice for the betterment of the family name. You survived, didn't you? You should be thanking us for making you strong. I looked at my father. He actually believed his own twisted logic. He truly believed that stealing from me was a noble sacrifice for the sake of their country club image. They had monetized my suffering to fund Malcolm's delusions of grandeur. I turned away from them and picked up a small remote control resting on the counter. I pointed it at the 80-inch smart television mounted on the far wall of the living room. The screen flickered to life. "My math skills did just fine, Dad," I said, pressing a button to mirror my iPad screen to the television. The screen displayed my primary private banking dashboard. The numbers were large, crisp, and undeniable. I watched as Calvin, Patricia, Malcolm, Richard, and Harper all turned their heads to look at the screen. I watched their eyes widen. I watched their jaws go slack as they processed the digits. The available liquid balance read $450 million, and that was just one account. It did not include the commercial real estate portfolio, the offshore holding companies, or the controlling shares in Apex Capital. "I survived perfectly fine without your grandmother's life insurance." I continued walking over to stand beneath the massive screen. "I took the loans. I did the work. I built an empire while you were busy buying golf clubs and custom gowns. And Malcolm." I turned my gaze to my brother, who was staring at the screen as if it were a mirage. He looked physically ill. His Ivy League degree led to a failed app, a bankrupt logistics company, and a fake vice president title funded entirely by the sister you deemed unfit for your wedding. And to top off your incredible family legacy, you married a broke white woman who is currently calculating exactly how fast she can divorce you now that she knows the gravy train does not exist. Harper flinched as if she had been slapped. She looked at the screen, then at Malcolm, her face twisting into a mask of pure revulsion. She had endured the cultural differences, the overbearing in-laws, and the suffocating expectations of the black elite social scene, solely for the promise of generational wealth. Now she realized she had shackled herself to a jobless man whose family was living on borrowed time and stolen money. "You lied to me," Harper whispered, her voice trembling with absolute fury. "You told me you were a multimillionaire. You told me your family owned half of Atlanta. You are nothing. You are a fraud." Malcolm reached for her again, desperation making his voice crack. "Harper, please. We can figure this out. I have a degree. I have connections. My fraternity brothers will help me." "Your fraternity brothers only tolerated you because your father paid the bar tabs," Harper snapped, slapping his hand away with brutal force. "I am not going down with this sinking ship. I am not spending my life married to a broke, unemployed loser who lives off his sister's charity." She reached for her left hand and violently yanked the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger. She threw it directly at Malcolm's chest. The ring bounced off his tuxedo jacket and skittered across the hardwood floor, coming to a rest near my stylish Italian leather boots. "I am done," Harper declared, grabbing the handle of her designer travel bag. "I am filing for an annulment tomorrow morning. Do not ever contact me again." She spun around on her heels and marched furiously toward the private elevator, her father Richard trailing behind her, looking utterly defeated and humiliated. They wanted nothing more than to escape the disastrous reality they had stumbled into. But I was not finished. The masterclass in accountability was only halfway through. I stepped forward, my voice ringing out clear and sharp across the penthouse. "Hold on, Harper," I called out. Harper stopped just short of the elevator doors. She turned back to glare at me, her face streaked with ruined mascara and angry tears. "I do not owe you anything," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "I am leaving this pathetic family. Keep your money and your miserable brother." I smiled, retrieving my iPad from the counter. I tapped the screen a few times, pulling up a specific legal document, and mirrored it to the large television. The image of the banking dashboard vanished, replaced by a scanned copy of a heavily initialed commercial contract. "I do not care about my brother Harper," I said, walking toward her. "But we are not quite done talking about your wedding venue." Harper frowned, looking at the contract displayed on the screen. "What are you talking about?" I pointed to the television. "You recognize that document, don't you? It is the master rental agreement for the Chateau estate. The venue you specifically demanded because it was the most exclusive location in the state. The venue that is currently holding your luggage hostage for an unpaid balance of $125,000. Harper crossed her arms defensively. "So what? That is Calvin's problem. His credit card declined. I am annulling the marriage. It has nothing to do with me." I tapped the screen again, zooming in on the bottom of the contract. The signatures filled the screen in massive, undeniable detail. "Actually, Harper, it has everything to do with you," I explained, my tone dripping with false sympathy. "You see, the Chateau estate requires the bride and groom to sign as primary guarantors on the event contract. Calvin was listed as the payment method, but your signature is right there on the bottom line. You legally guaranteed the debt." Harper's face dropped. She looked at the signature, then back at me, panic beginning to replace her anger. "I did not read the fine print. I just signed where they told me to. Calvin said he was paying for it." "Ignorance of the contract does not invalidate it," I reminded her. "And here is the truly unfortunate part for you." I tapped the screen one final time, bringing up a property deed. "I bought the Chateau estate 6 months ago as a real estate investment to diversify my commercial portfolio. You did not just rack up a $125,000 bill with a random vendor. You owe that money directly to me." Richard stepped forward, his face red and sweating. "Now listen here. You cannot hold my daughter responsible for this. We do not have that kind of money." "I know you don't, Richard," I replied smoothly. "That is why my legal team did not bother sending you a demand letter. Since Harper's name is on the contract, and your name is on her primary financial accounts as a co-signer from her college days, my lawyers filed an emergency motion this morning. We have already placed a lien on whatever meager assets your family has left. Your leased vehicles, your remaining bank accounts, the equity in your mortgaged home. It is all frozen until the debt is settled." Richard slumped against the wall of the elevator alcove, physically buckling under the weight of the revelation. His faux old money facade was entirely decimated. He was a bankrupt man trapped in a legal nightmare orchestrated by the very woman he had called a fraud just 30 minutes earlier. Harper began to hyperventilate. She dropped her designer bag, her hands flying to her head as she realized she was legally chained to the disaster she was trying to flee. "You cannot do this," she sobbed, sinking to the floor in her expensive clothes. "I do not have it. I cannot pay you. Please." Calvin, who had been standing in stunned silence, suddenly erupted. The absolute humiliation of watching his wealthy white in-laws completely broken by his estranged daughter triggered a desperate, flailing need to assert dominance. He could not accept that he had lost. He could not accept that the power dynamic had permanently shifted. "You listen to me!" Danielle, Calvin roared, storming toward me with his fists clenched. The security guards immediately stepped forward, but I held my ground, staring him down. "I am still your father!" Calvin bellowed, his voice echoing off the glass windows. "You will not humiliate this family in front of these people. You will not terrorize your brother's wife. If you do not call your lawyers and drop these liens right now, I will officially write you out of the will. I will disown you completely. You will never set foot in the Atlanta family mansion again. You will get absolutely nothing when I die. You are dead to me." I stood there, letting his threats wash over me. He was offering to disown a multimillionaire. He was threatening to cut me out of a will that possessed zero assets. He was clinging to the illusion of the Atlanta mansion as his final weapon of control, a king, threatening to banish a knight from a castle made of sand. I looked at his desperate, furious face. I looked at Patricia, who was weeping quietly near the kitchen island. I looked at Malcolm, who was still staring blankly at the floor. I smiled a lethal, chilling smile. "The Atlanta mansion?" I asked quietly. The silence in the room thickened, pulling the air from my lungs. Malcolm did not like the question. He stepped out from behind his weeping bride, puffing his chest out to its maximum capacity. He adjusted the lapels of his tuxedo, a nervous habit he had carried since childhood whenever he was trying to look larger than he actually was. "Dad's logistics company?" Malcolm sneered, his voice dripping with unearned confidence. "The one I am the vice president of. The company that is going to clear 8 figures next year and make me a millionaire before I turn 30. No thanks to you, of course. You bitter spinster. You can sit in your glass tower playing with other people's money, but I actually run a physical empire." I looked at him. Truly looked at him. Malcolm had always possessed the kind of loud charisma that disguised a spectacular lack of substance. He was a man who wore success like a costume he had purchased off a rack. He believed his own lies so deeply that reality had become a foreign language to him. I did not sigh. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached back into the leather tote resting on the counter and withdrew a third folder. This one was not red. It was a stark, clinical black. I placed my hand flat against its matte surface. "You mean the company you ran into the ground 3 years ago?" I asked, my voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows. Malcolm's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, crossing his arms over his chest. "I do not know what you are talking about." I opened the black folder. "I am talking about the $300,000 you blew on that catastrophic mobile app venture. The one you convinced Dad was going to revolutionize the supply chain industry. You hired your fraternity brothers as consultants. You rented out premium office space in Midtown Atlanta that you never used. You hosted lavish launch parties for a product that did not even possess a functioning beta version." Calvin shifted uncomfortably, his face turning a deeper shade of red. "That was a minor setback," he grumbled. "A learning experience for a young executive." "A learning experience," I repeated, tasting the sheer absurdity of the phrase. "It was a fatal hemorrhage. You leveraged the company equipment to cover his losses, Dad. You mortgaged the commercial warehouses because you were terrified of the public humiliation. You could not bear the thought of your elite social circle at the country club and your prestigious fraternity brothers finding out that your golden boy was an incompetent fraud. So you quietly sought a bailout." Malcolm let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. "You are delusional, Danielle. We expanded. Dad brought on a silent partner to help us scale the operations. I am still the vice president. I am still the heir to the business." I picked up a heavy stack of stapled papers from the black folder. These were the official incorporation documents, the binding legal contracts that dictated the exact ownership structure of the logistics firm. I walked around the marble island, closing the distance between me and my brother. "Dad went bankrupt 3 years ago," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Malcolm's. "To save your reputation, to maintain this fragile illusion of wealth, he quietly sold 80% of the company's equity. He sold it to an anonymous private equity firm through a blind trust. He was so desperate for cash, so desperate to keep his social standing intact, that he did not even read the fine print. He just took the check and prayed the new majority owners would remain silent." I stopped less than 2 feet away from Malcolm. I raised the stack of documents and threw them directly at his chest. The heavy paper hit his tuxedo shirt with a loud smack before scattering across the imported rug at our feet. "I am that firm Malcolm," I said softly. The words dropped into the room like an anvil. Malcolm's eyes widened, his gaze darting from my face to the papers on the floor. Calvin let out a strangled sound, taking a step backward as if the floor had suddenly turned to ice. "I own 80% of your legacy," I continued, my voice relentless and steady. "Apex Capital is the parent company of the trust that bailed you out. You do not own a physical empire, Malcolm. You do not own anything. And you are certainly not the vice president." "What are you saying?" Malcolm stammered, his chest deflating, his arrogant posture crumbling into dust. "I am saying you are my employee," I replied. "And honestly, you have been a terrible one. I have spent the last 3 years auditing your expense reports. The 3-hour lunches at 5-star restaurants, the golf outings you categorized as client development, the leased luxury vehicles. You have not brought in a single new contract since I took ownership. You have been drawing a massive salary from a company that I keep afloat." Harper was staring at Malcolm, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Richard looked as though he might physically collapse. The realization that they had married into a family owned by the very woman they had just insulted was breaking their minds in real time. "So I made an executive decision," I said, stepping back and folding my arms. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, your position has been terminated for gross incompetence. Your company email has been deactivated. Your company vehicle will be repossessed by noon. You are unemployed, Malcolm." Malcolm stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. The reality of his complete destruction was too massive for his fragile ego to process. He looked to his father for help for salvation, but Calvin was staring at the floor, a broken, defeated man who had gambled his entire life on a losing horse. It was Patricia who broke the silence. "The transformation in my mother was terrifying. The polished society matron vanished, entirely replaced by a woman consumed by a feral, unhinged panic. Her golden child was being stripped of his title, his wealth, and his dignity right in front of her eyes. The life she had built, the status she worshipped, was burning to ash." "You evil witch!" Patricia lunged forward, her hands curled into claws. My security guard stepped in immediately, catching her by the arms before she could reach me. She fought against them, screaming, kicking her designer heels, thrashing wildly in the air. Her perfectly styled hair fell around her face in a chaotic mess. "Let me go!" she shrieked, her voice raw and tearing at the edges. "You stole our legacy. You stole everything from us. You planned this. You sat in your miserable little corner and plotted against your own blood." I stood perfectly still, watching her unravel. "I did not steal anything, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical screaming. "I bought what Dad was selling because he was too weak to let his son face the consequences of his own failure." "You are a monster!" Patricia sobbed, pulling against the guards. "You have no right to this money. You do not deserve any of this. You only have that empire because we gave you nothing. You only have that money because we cashed out your grandmother's life insurance to pay for your brother's Ivy League degree, forcing you to work." The entire penthouse seemed to freeze. The air went entirely still. Patricia suddenly stopped struggling. Her eyes went wide, round, and terrified as her own words echoed off the glass walls. She gasped, slapping her hands over her mouth, but it was too late. The truth had escaped. The ugly, rotten secret she had kept buried for 15 years was suddenly exposed to the light of day. I felt a cold, dark pressure settle in the center of my chest. The noise of the city, the breathing of the people in the room, everything faded away until there was only the sound of my own pulse. My grandmother had been the only person in the world who loved me without conditions. When she died, I was a sophomore in college. Patricia had looked me in the eye and told me there was no money. She told me the funeral had wiped out whatever small savings my grandmother had left. She watched me drop out of my extracurriculars. She watched me take night shifts at a diner just to pay for my textbooks. She watched me cry from exhaustion. And all the while she had my grandmother's money. She had stolen the life insurance policy meant for me and handed it to Malcolm so he could join a fraternity and drive a luxury car. The silence stretched out, suffocating and absolute. Even Harper and Richard were staring at Patricia in horror. Stealing from a business partner was one thing, but stealing a dead grandmother's life insurance from your own child to fund a golden boy's partying was a level of depravity that even they could not stomach. I looked at my mother, seeing her clearly for the first time in my life. She was not just colorist. She was not just an elitist snob. She was a thief. I signaled the guards to release her. They let go of her arms and she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the hem of her silk gown. "I did not mean," Patricia stammered, her hands trembling violently. "Danielle, you have to understand." I walked toward her, my movements slow, deliberate, and predatory. The coldness inside me had completely frozen over, replacing any lingering hurt with absolute clarity. "So you finally admit it," I said, my voice so soft it commanded total silence. You told me Grandma left nothing. You let me work 3 jobs. You let me sleep in my car for a semester when I could not make rent. You watched me nearly starve just so Malcolm could join a prestigious fraternity and buy a BMW. Calvin stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Patricia's arm. His face was gray, but he still clung to his twisted justifications. You have to look at the bigger picture, Danielle, he said, his voice shaking. It was an investment. Malcolm had the potential to elevate this family's status. We had to position him for success. You were just a dark-skinned girl who liked math. You were never going to marry into the right circles. You were never going to be the face of this family. We made a choice for the family. I stared at the man who contributed to half my DNA. He was defending the theft. He was rationalizing the abuse. He truly believed that my skin tone and my gender made me a sacrificial lamb for Malcolm's glory. I turned away from them. I walked over to the marble island and picked up my phone. With a few quick swipes, I opened my primary offshore banking application. I connected the device to the 80-inch smart television mounted on the far wall. The screen flickered, transitioning from a blank black canvas to the crisp blue and white interface of my financial portfolio. I did not say a word. I simply let them look. The numbers glowed brightly in the center of the screen. The available liquid balance read $450 million. That was just the cash reserves. It did not factor in the real estate, the corporate acquisitions, or the equity in Apex Capital. My math skills did just fine. Dad, I said without looking at him. My eyes remained locked on the screen. I survived the theft. I survived the starvation. I took out the loans and I paid them back with blood and sweat while your son was playing dress-up in a borrowed suit. I slowly turned my head to look at Malcolm, who was staring at the television screen as if his brain had completely shut down. And Malcolm. I continued, my voice carrying the sharp edge of a blade. His Ivy League degree led to him marrying a broke white woman who is currently calculating how fast she can divorce him. Harper whipped her head around to look at Malcolm. The disgust on her face was absolute. The realization that she had tethered herself to an unemployed fraud whose family was millions of dollars in debt hit her like a freight train. Her eyes darted from the staggering wealth displayed on the screen back to her pathetic, newly minted husband. "You are broke," Harper asked, her voice a sharp, hysterical whisper. "Your family does not own anything." Malcolm reached out his hands, trembling. "Harper, baby, please, we can fix this. I have connections. I can get another job." "Do not touch me!" Harper screamed, slapping his hands away with enough force to echo through the room. "You lied to me. You told me you were old money. You told me you were a vice president. You are nothing. You are a parasite living off the sister you treated like garbage." She reached for her left hand, her fingers clawing at the massive diamond engagement ring Malcolm had given her. The ring that had likely been purchased on one of the very credit cards I had frozen just hours ago. With a violent yank, she pulled the ring off her finger and threw it directly at Malcolm's face. The diamond struck him in the chest before clattering onto the hardwood floor. Harper grabbed the handle of her overnight bag, her chest heaving. "I am getting an annulment," she spat. "I am leaving. Dad, let us go." She spun on her heels, marching furiously toward the private elevator. Richard looked at my parents with pure revulsion before turning to follow his daughter, desperate to escape the toxic wasteland of the Addams family. They were almost at the elevator doors when I spoke. My voice was calm, but it carried a command that made them freeze in their tracks. "Hold on, Harper," I said, walking slowly toward the center of the room. "We aren't done talking about your wedding venue." "You mean the massive 10,000-square-foot colonial in Buckhead?" I clarified, my voice steady and completely devoid of empathy. "The one with the imported Italian marble floors and the Olympic-sized swimming pool. The one you love to host your alumni galas in, just to prove to everyone how far you have come." "Yes," Calvin barked, his chest still puffed out, though his eyes darted nervously around the room. "My house. The house I built with my own 2 hands. The house you will never step foot in again. You are cut off, Danielle." I let out a short, bitter laugh that echoed against the glass walls of the penthouse. "Dad, You have not owned that house in over 4 years. The remaining color drained from Calvin's face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Patricia stopped weeping and stared at him, her tear-streaked face suddenly frozen in confusion. I reached for my iPad and tapped the screen once more. The banking dashboard on the 80-inch television vanished and was replaced by a digital copy of a property deed alongside a notice of foreclosure. When Malcolm ran his logistics app into the ground and cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars, you were too proud to admit defeat, I explained, walking slowly around the kitchen island. You could not bear the thought of your elite social circle at the country club finding out that your golden boy was an incompetent failure. So you took out a third mortgage on the Atlanta mansion to cover the debts. And when the logistics business completely tanked, you defaulted on that mortgage. The bank put it up for private auction. Patricia grabbed Calvin's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his tuxedo jacket. Calvin, what is she talking about? Patricia asked, her voice trembling. Tell me she is lying. Tell me we still own our home. Calvin could not look at her. He stared fixedly at the television screen, his breathing shallow and rapid. He cannot tell you that, Mom, because it is the truth. I said, the bank was going to evict you. They were going to put your belongings on the street for all your wealthy neighbors to see. So Dad made a desperate deal. He found a private real estate investment firm willing to buy the house at auction and rent it back to him at an exorbitant monthly rate. You have been paying rent to live in your own home for 4 years just to keep up appearances. You are nothing but tenants in a house you pretend to own. I paused, letting the absolute humiliation wash over them before delivering the final fatal blow. I tapped the screen one last time, bringing up the incorporation documents for the real estate firm that owned the property. And I own that investment firm, Dad? I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the entire room. I bought the Atlanta mansion. I am your landlord. Patricia let out a sound that was less of a scream and more of a dying gasp. She released Calvin's arm and stumbled backward, crashing into the expensive leather sofa. She looked at the screen, reading my name in bold black letters across the legal documents. All those rent checks you struggled to pay every month? I continued, my tone surgical and precise. All the times you skimped on groceries so you could afford to pay the landlord and keep your country club membership active. That money was going directly into my accounts. The daughter you called a failure was funding your entire fake reality. Malcolm fell to his knees. The golden child, the supposed heir to the family legacy, simply collapsed onto my hardwood floor. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as the sheer magnitude of his ruin finally crushed him. He had no money. He had no business. His bride was leaving him. And now he did not even have a childhood home to return to. Harper and Richard did not stay to watch the rest. Harper grabbed her designer bag and sprinted for the private elevator, hitting the call button frantically. Richard followed her. His head hung low, utterly defeated. The elevator doors opened and they scrambled inside, disappearing from my life forever, without a single backward glance. They were rats fleeing a sinking ship, but my parents were still trapped on board. You cannot do this, Calvin whispered, his voice completely broken. His shoulders slumped and he suddenly looked like a very old, very tired man. You cannot take our home, Danielle. It is all we have left. We will be ruined. My fraternity brothers, the board members, everyone will know. They will know exactly who you are, I agreed. And since you just attempted to authorize a fraudulent charge of $125,000 on frozen credit lines that legally belong to me, you are in breach of the morality clause in your lease agreement. I filed the eviction papers this morning while you were busy trying to force your way past the velvet ropes of a wedding venue you could not afford. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my property. Patricia slid off the sofa and onto her knees. The woman who had criticized my natural hair, the woman who had mocked my vintage clothes, the woman who had stolen my grandmother's life insurance to pay for Malcolm's fraternity dues was now kneeling on my floor. Danielle, please. Patricia begged, tears streaming down her face, ruining whatever makeup she had left. Please do not do this. I am your mother. You are my flesh and blood. You cannot put your own parents on the street. We are family." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no satisfaction in seeing her on her knees. There was only a profound, hollow emptiness where my love for her used to be. "We stopped being a family the day you stole my future to fund his," I said, pointing a steady finger at Malcolm, who was still sobbing on the floor. "You told me family requires sacrifice, but you only ever expected me to do the sacrificing. You took the money my grandmother left for my education, and you gave it to him so he could drive a BMW. You watched me sleep in my car for a semester when I could not make rent. You watched me starve. And you did nothing, because to you I was just a dark-skinned girl who did not fit your aesthetic." Patricia reached out, trying to grab the hem of my silk trousers. I stepped back out of her reach. "You made your choice, Mom," I said, my voice cold and final. "You chose the golden child. Now you can live with the consequences." I raised my hand and signaled the two security guards who had been standing silently by the entrance the entire time. They stepped forward immediately, their faces impassive and professional. "Escort them out," I ordered, turning my back on my family, "and ensure their keycards are deactivated. They are never to set foot in this building again." "No, Danielle." "Please," Calvin cried out as the guards firmly grasped his arms. "You cannot leave us like this. What are we going to do?" I did not answer. I walked into my kitchen, picked up my half-empty espresso cup and carried it to the sink. The guards hauled my father toward the elevator. Patricia wailed loudly, thrashing weakly against the guard who was lifting her off the floor. Malcolm did not fight. He simply let the security team drag him out, his spirit completely broken. The polished steel doors of the elevator slid shut with a soft hiss, cutting off my mother's desperate pleas. The penthouse was instantly filled with a profound, heavy silence. The chaos was gone. The toxicity was gone. The people who had spent my entire life making me feel small and unworthy were finally removed from my world forever. I stood alone in the center of the massive living room, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling New York City skyline. The sun was high now, bathing the city in bright, unapologetic light. I took a deep breath, letting the clean, conditioned air fill my lungs. For the first time in 35 years, I felt completely, entirely free. The fallout over the next few weeks was swift and brutal. The news of the eviction and the frozen credit lines spread through their elite social circle like wildfire. Harper filed for an annulment the very next morning, publicly citing financial fraud as the reason. The country club revoked my parents' membership, citing unpaid dues and behavior unbecoming of the establishment. Calvin's fraternity brothers distanced themselves, treating him like a pariah. Without the illusion of wealth to protect him, Malcolm was forced to face reality. He moved into a cheap motel on the outskirts of Atlanta and took a minimum-wage job working the night shift at a logistics warehouse, an ironic twist of fate that I found mildly amusing. My parents, completely stripped of their social standing and their assets, were forced to move into a tiny two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood they used to actively avoid driving through. They tried calling my office several times over the next few months, begging for loans, begging for forgiveness, begging for a second chance. I instructed my assistants to permanently block their numbers and forward any written correspondence directly to the shredder. There was nothing left to say. I had spent my life craving their validation, hoping that one day they would see my hard work and finally be proud of me. I had wanted them to recognize that my quiet determination was just as valuable as Malcolm's loud charisma. But some people are so blinded by their own superficial desires that they will never see the gold hidden right in front of them. Instead of dwelling on the family I had lost, I poured my energy into the family I was creating. I used a portion of the profits from the logistics company acquisition to launch a massive charitable foundation. The Dorothy Adams Foundation, named in honor of the grandmother who had truly loved me, provided full-ride scholarships for young women of color pursuing degrees in finance, mathematics, and business. I wanted to ensure that no other girl would ever have to sleep in her car or work 3 jobs just to get an education because her family deemed her unworthy of investment. One evening, about a year after the confrontation in the penthouse, I hosted a gala for the foundation at a prestigious venue in Manhattan. The room was filled with brilliant, ambitious young women, investors, mentors, and friends who had supported me throughout my career. These were the people who saw my value, the people who celebrated my successes, the people who constituted my true chosen family. As I stood on the stage looking out at the sea of smiling faces, I realized that the best revenge was not the eviction or the frozen credit cards. The best revenge was simply living a beautiful, successful life, completely untouched by their toxicity. They had tried to bury me, but they didn't know I was a seed, and now I was blooming in a garden they would never be allowed to enter. I raised my glass to the crowd, taking a sip of the expensive champagne. The liquid was cold, crisp, and sweet, the taste of absolute, final, undeniable victory. The Atlanta mansion, I asked quietly, letting the words hang in the heavy air of the penthouse. Yes! Calvin yelled, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as the veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar. The 6-bedroom estate in Buckhead. The only real asset this family has left. It goes to Malcolm today. It is his birthright. You will never see a single dime of it. You will never walk through those wrought iron gates again. You are cut off from your history, Danielle. That house is the crown jewel of our legacy, and it belongs to my son. I stood perfectly still, listening to his desperate, booming voice. He was clinging to that house like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood in a hurricane. The Buckhead estate was his entire identity. It was a massive, sprawling colonial property with imported marble floors, a grand sweeping staircase, and an Olympic-sized pool where my parents hosted their lavish summer galas. It was the ultimate symbol of their status among the black elite of Atlanta. They had spent my entire childhood treating that house like a museum and treating me like an unwanted tourist inside it. I remembered the coldness of those hallways. I remembered being told to stay out of the grand living room when my mother's society friends came over because my natural hair and quiet demeanor did not fit the aesthetic she wanted to project. That house was a monument to their vanity, and they had guarded it fiercely. I looked at the man who had spent his entire life measuring human worth by square footage and zip codes. His chest was heaving. His fists were clenched, and he truly believed he still held the ultimate trump card. He believed he could banish a queen from a kingdom he did not even control. I turned away from the kitchen island and walked slowly across the expansive living room. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood, a sharp, measured sound that seemed to make my parents flinch with every step. I approached a large, modern, abstract painting hanging on the far wall. I reached behind the frame and pressed a hidden panel. The wall clicked and a small digital safe was revealed. I punched in a 6-digit code and the heavy steel door swung open. Inside, resting in the dark, was a thick stack of legal files. I reached in and pulled out a heavy manila folder bound with thick rubber bands and covered in official notary seals and state stamps. I walked back to the kitchen island where Calvin, Patricia, and Malcolm were watching me with a mixture of confusion and mounting terror. I dropped the heavy stack of notarized documents directly in front of Calvin. The slap of the thick paper against the marble counter echoed loudly through the penthouse, sounding like a gavel coming down in a silent courtroom. "Dad, you have not owned the Buckhead mansion for 4 years," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and devoid of any emotion. Calvin stared at the folder and then snapped his eyes up to mine. He let out a harsh, breathless laugh that sounded more like a cough. "What kind of sick game are you playing, Danielle? My name is on the deed. I built that house. I have the mortgage." I rested my fingertips lightly on the top of the folder. "You had the mortgage, Dad," I corrected him gently. "But when Malcolm ran his little logistics app into the ground and cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars, you panicked. You drained your savings trying to cover his tracks. And when that was not enough, you stopped paying the mortgage on the Buckhead estate. You thought you could catch up, but the debt just kept compounding. The bank sent you notices, they sent you warnings, and then they finally foreclosed." Patricia gasped, taking a stumbling step toward the counter. Her hands were trembling so violently that her diamond bracelets rattled against each other. "Calvin, What is she talking about? Patricia demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. Tell me she is lying. Tell me we still own our home. Calvin could not look at her. He stared fixedly at the heavy folder on the marble counter, his skin turning a sickly shade of gray. His mouth opened, but his throat seemed completely paralyzed. He cannot tell you that, Mom, because he knows exactly what happened. I continued, turning my gaze to my mother. 4 years ago, the bank took the house. You were terrified, Mom. You were terrified that your country club friends and your elite social circle would find out you were broke. You could not bear the thought of the public humiliation of an eviction. You could not stomach the idea of moving into a smaller house in a normal neighborhood. You were desperate to keep up the rich facade at all costs. I slowly untied the rubber bands on the folder and flipped it open, spreading the heavy legal documents across the counter so they could all see the state seals and the official signatures. And then miraculously, I said, my tone dripping with a dark, theatrical sympathy. A generous private real estate group swooped in. They bought the estate at the public auction, paying off the bank in cash. And instead of kicking you out, they approached Dad with a quiet, discreet offer. They allowed you to sign a lease and stay in the house. They rented it back to you for pennies on the dollar. They let you keep living your lavish lifestyle, pretending to the world that you still own the property. You signed that lease, Dad, without asking a single question about who the buyers actually were. You were so relieved to maintain your precious social standing that you just blindly signed the paperwork and kept playing the role of the wealthy patriarch. Calvin was shaking now. His large hands were gripping the edge of the marble island so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He looked down at the lease agreement resting on top of the pile. He saw his own signature at the bottom. And then his eyes drifted up to the top of the page to the name of the holding company that owned the property. Apex Real Estate Holdings. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely hollowed out. The realization was crashing down on him, suffocating him, drowning him in the absolute totality of his own failure. I own that real estate group, Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, chilling whisper that filled every corner of the room. I bought the Buckhead mansion 4 years ago. I own the roof over your head. You do not have an estate to leave to Malcolm. You are nothing but a tenant living in my house. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. It was the sound of an entire false reality completely shattering into millions of irreparable pieces. Patricia let out a sound that was barely human. It was a guttural, scraping wail of pure agony. Her legs gave out completely. She dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor, her designer silk dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. The illusion of her black elite status was entirely annihilated. She owned nothing. Her husband owned nothing. Her golden child owned nothing. The country club memberships, the designer clothes, the lavish parties, it had all been funded by the silent grace of the daughter she had despised and discarded. She was completely, absolutely at my mercy. We have been paying rent to you, Patricia sobbed, looking up at me from the floor, her face smeared with ruined makeup and tears. We have been living in your house. I looked down at her, feeling an absolute void where my empathy used to be. Yes, Mom, I replied. Every single month for 4 years you have been sending a check to my holding company. You have been paying me to keep your secret. You sold my grandmother's life insurance to fund Malcolm's delusions, and I used the empire I built to buy the very ground you sleep on. Richard and Harper, who had been frozen in horror near the elevator doors, suddenly seemed to realize that the toxic rot of my family ran deeper than they could ever comprehend. Harper looked at Malcolm, who was still staring blankly at the floor, unable to process that his promised inheritance was a complete hallucination. He was a prince of a kingdom that did not exist. Richard grabbed Harper's arm and practically dragged her into the elevator, pressing the button frantically to escape the sheer devastation radiating through the penthouse. Calvin finally found his voice, though it was weak and broken. It lacked all the booming authority he had wielded just moments ago. Danielle. Please, Calvin whispered, tears finally welling in his eyes. You cannot do this. We are your parents. That house is our entire life. Where will we go? I picked up my iPad from the counter and tapped the screen, waking it up. I looked at the glowing digital clock displayed in the corner. I did not look at him. I did not offer a single ounce of comfort. I raised my left wrist, pushing back the sleeve of my silk blazer, and checked my watch, adjusting the silver band with maddening precision. You are right, Dad, I said, my voice flat and clinical. I am your daughter, but you are the one who just stood in my penthouse and told me I was dead to you. You are the one who told me I would never set foot in the Atlanta mansion again. You are the one who said I do not belong in this family. I lowered my wrist and locked my eyes onto his meeting, his terrified gaze with absolute icy resolve. And since you told me I do not belong in your family, I have decided to evict my tenants. I declared, the words slicing through the room like a guillotine. You breached the morality clause in your lease the moment you attempted to use fraudulent funds to pay for this disastrous wedding. My lawyers served the formal 7-day eviction notice to the property manager exactly an hour ago. The papers are already taped to the front door of the Buckhead estate. Patricia wailed again, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably into the hardwood floor. Malcolm fell back against the kitchen cabinet, sliding down, until he was sitting on the floor next to his mother, completely catatonic. You have exactly 1 week to pack your bags, I said, stepping back from the counter and signaling the security guards. Make sure you clean the carpets before you hand over the keys. I am putting the property on the market next month. The arrogance was completely gone. It had evaporated from the room entirely, leaving behind nothing but the raw, pathetic desperation of people who suddenly realized they were standing on a trap door that had just swung open. Patricia did not just cry. She abandoned every single ounce of the polished, high society dignity she had spent her entire adult life cultivating. She dragged herself across the smooth, hardwood floor of the penthouse. The heavy silk of her designer gown snagged under her knees, but she did not care. She crawled toward me like a beggar. Patricia reached out with her trembling hands and grabbed my ankles. Her fingers dug into my skin through the sheer fabric of my trousers. Her tear-streaked face was pointed up at me, contorted into a mask of absolute terror. Danielle, please, Patricia begged, her voice cracking so violently it sounded like glass shattering in her throat. We are your parents. You cannot do this. You know how our community works. You know how vicious they can be. If we get evicted, we will be the laughingstock of Atlanta. She was hyperventilating now, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the reality of her social demise crashed down on her. We will lose our standing in the church. Patricia sobbed, her grip on my ankles tightening. The country clubs, the charity boards, the alumni associations, everything we have built. Our friends will turn their backs on us. We will be ruined. You cannot do this to your own blood. Please, Danielle, I am begging you. I looked down at her. My mother, the woman who had spent 35 years making me feel like an unwelcome guest in my own family. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, thick streaks. Her perfectly set hair was sticking to her wet face. She was crying not because she realized she had deeply traumatized her daughter. She was crying because she was terrified of what the other country club wives would whisper about her over Sunday brunch. I felt a wave of profound physical revulsion wash over me. I stepped back, pulling my foot out of her desperate grasp with a sharp jerk. She slumped forward, her hands hitting the floor as I put distance between us. Blood. I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a lethal psychological weight that filled the entire penthouse. Do not ever use that word with me. Do not dare invoke the concept of family now when it is convenient for you. I walked slowly around her, looking down at the pathetic figures of my parents. You used my skin tone and my quiet nature as an excuse to treat me like a servant in my own home, I said, dissecting their toxicity with surgical precision. From the time I was a little girl, you made it clear that I was too dark, too introverted, too different to fit into your pristine country club image. You prioritized a fake superficial image over the well-being of your own daughter. You wanted to play the talented 10th. You wanted to parade around Atlanta pretending you were the pinnacle of Black excellence, all while you were financially bleeding me dry behind closed doors. Calvin kept his eyes glued to the floor, refusing to look at me as I dismantled the house of cards he had built. You preached about generational wealth and legacy while you literally stole from a dead woman? I continued, my words falling like heavy stones. You took the only thing my grandmother left me, and you fed it to Malcolm because he had the right look and the right gender. You monetized my suffering so you could buy expensive cars and host lavish parties. You do not care about me, Mom. You have never cared about me. You only care about your fake friends finding out that you are completely broke. You are terrified they will realize you are just as hollow and empty as they are. Malcolm, who had been sitting paralyzed on the floor, suddenly scrambled to his feet. The sheer humiliation of watching his mother crawl and hearing his father defeated seemed to trigger a desperate primal need to assert whatever fragile masculinity he had left. His face was flushed red, and his chest heaved as he pointed a shaking finger at me. "You are a monster!" Danielle Malcolm yelled, his voice cracking under the strain of his panic. "You are sick. You planned this all along to destroy us. You set this whole thing up just to watch us fall. You are a psychopath." I turned my attention to my brother. He was sweating through his expensive tuxedo shirt. His entire life had been handed to him on a silver platter paid for by my suffering, and yet he still had the audacity to play the victim. "I did not plan to destroy you, Malcolm." I fired back, my tone plunging to a freezing temperature. "I planned to survive. I planned to make sure I would never have to beg for a scrap of food or a safe place to sleep ever again. I bought your debt because it was a sound business decision and because you were too incompetent to run a company. I did not have to orchestrate your downfall. You did that all on your own." I stepped closer to him, watching the fear flare in his eyes as I invaded his space. "You destroyed yourselves the second you kicked me out of that wedding," I said, leaning in slightly. "You thought you were banishing the embarrassing sister. You thought you were protecting your elite image for your wealthy white in-laws. But all you did was lock the door on the only person keeping your miserable lives afloat. You uninvited the bank, Malcolm. You uninvited the landlord. And now you are facing the consequences of your own bottomless arrogance." Malcolm opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. He simply backed away from me, his knees hitting the edge of the sofa as he collapsed onto it, staring at me with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. He finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. The atmosphere in the penthouse was suffocating. The reality of their complete financial and social annihilation had settled deeply into the bones of every person in the room. Patricia was still weeping on the floor. Calvin was staring blankly at the wall. Malcolm was hyperventilating on the couch. And then the dynamic shifted violently. Richard, who had been standing near the elevator alcove, completely decimated by the revelation that his daughter was legally chained to a massive debt, suddenly snapped. The polished veneer of the wealthy coastal elite completely shattered. He was facing personal bankruptcy. His daughter's life was in ruins, and the family he thought would elevate their status had turned out to be a toxic parasitic mirage. The sheer stress and humiliation boiled over into a blind, aggressive rage. His face turned a mottled purple color, and the veins in his forehead throbbed. He looked at me, and all the blame and fury he felt toward the Addams family transferred directly onto my shoulders. "You ruined my daughter!" Richard roared, his voice echoing like a gunshot. Before anyone could react, he lunged forward. He moved with a sudden explosive speed, closing the distance between the elevator alcove and the kitchen island. His hands were raised, his fingers curled into fists, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. "I will kill you before I let you bankrupt me," he screamed, spit flying from his mouth as he charged directly at me. I did not flinch. I did not even take a step back. I simply stood my ground, my face perfectly impassive. Before Richard could even come within 5 feet of me, the atmosphere in the room violently erupted. The 2 massive armed security guards who had been waiting quietly in the shadows near the entrance moved with terrifying instantaneous precision. They were trained professionals built like freight trains, and they responded to the threat with brutal, overwhelming force. The first guard hit Richard from the side, a massive shoulder tackling him with the impact of a car crash. Richard let out a breathless grunt as the air was forcefully expelled from his lungs. His feet left the ground entirely. The second guard moved in simultaneously, grabbing Richard's outstretched arm and twisting it sharply behind his back. They drove him directly into the hardwood floor. The impact was sickeningly loud, a heavy thud of bone and muscle hitting solid oak. The polished floorboards seemed to vibrate from the force of the takedown. Richard let out a strangled cry of pain as his face was pressed hard against the floor, his cheek flattening against the wood. The guards pinned him down effortlessly, putting their heavy knees into his back and shoulders, immobilizing him completely. One of the guards smoothly unclipped a pair of heavy zip ties from his tactical belt, binding Richard's wrists together behind his back with a sharp zip sound that cut through the sudden silence of the room. "Stay on the ground." The lead guard barked, his voice, deep, authoritative, and completely devoid of mercy. "Do not move a muscle, or I will break your arm." Richard groaned, struggling weakly against the overwhelming weight pinning him down. His expensive suit was rumpled, his dignity completely erased. He lay there gasping for breath, a broken, violent man subdued in an instant. The rest of the room was frozen in absolute terror. Patricia had stopped crying, her hands covering her mouth as she watched the violent takedown. Calvin had pressed himself against the counter, his eyes wide with fear. Malcolm was cowering on the sofa, pulling his knees up to his chest like a frightened child. They had spent their entire lives using psychological manipulation and financial abuse to control people. They had never faced raw physical consequence. I looked down at Richard, who was panting heavily against the floorboards. My expression remained completely unchanged, an impenetrable mask of cold authority. I slowly reached up and brushed a non-existent piece of lint from the lapel of my silk blazer. "I think it is time for everyone to leave," I said, my voice perfectly calm, echoing clearly in the stunned silence of the penthouse. I looked at the lead security guard, who was still pressing his knee into Richard's back. "Call the police," I instructed him. "Tell them we have an intruder who just attempted an assault. Let the authorities handle Mr. Harrington." And as for my family, I slowly turned my gaze back to Calvin, Patricia, and Malcolm. They looked like cornered animals, entirely stripped of their arrogance, their pride, and their illusions. They were nothing but empty shells. "Throw them out," I commanded. "Do not let them take anything but the clothes on their backs, and if they resist, you have my full authorization to use whatever force is necessary." The masterclass was officially over. The eviction had begun. The heavy oak door of my office swung open, and my lead corporate litigator, Marcus, walked in, holding a sleek leather briefcase. He took a seat across from my desk, his expression a mixture of professional intrigue and mild disbelief. "I have reviewed the complaint," Marcus said, pulling a copy of the lawsuit from his briefcase and laying it flat on the glass surface between us. "It is a spectacular work of fiction. Their attorney is a man named Gregory Vance. He operates out of a strip mall in Marietta. He specializes in slip-and-fall cases and threatening letters. He has no business engaging in corporate or high-net-worth litigation." "Which means they are broke," I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the desk. "No reputable firm would take this case on contingency, and they do not have the liquid assets to pay a retainer for a real lawyer." "Exactly." Marcus nodded, adjusting his glasses. "The claims of elder abuse and emotional distress are completely baseless. The lease agreement for the Buckhead estate is airtight. We have the foreclosure documents, the public auction records, and the signed rental contracts. Regarding your brother's termination, we have 3 years of audits proving gross negligence and corporate theft. If anything, you have grounds to sue him for embezzlement." I looked at the paperwork. $10 million. It was such a desperate, arbitrary number. They thought the threat of public scandal would force me to settle quietly to pay them off just to make them go away. They fundamentally misunderstood who I had become. "We could file a motion to dismiss tomorrow morning, and the judge would likely toss it out before lunch," Marcus suggested, watching my face carefully. It would save time. No, I replied, my voice completely devoid of hesitation. I do not want this dismissed. I want to proceed to discovery. Marcus raised an eyebrow, a slow understanding dawning on his face. You want to depose them? I want them under oath, I said. I want every single financial record they possess subpoenaed. I want their bank statements, their credit card debt, the records of the third mortgage they took out on the Atlanta house. I want the paper trail showing exactly where my grandmother's life insurance money went 15 years ago. If they want to claim predatory financial practices, we are going to open their entire financial history to the court. Marcus smiled a sharp predatory grin that matched my own. We will bury them in discovery. Vance will not have the manpower or the resources to handle the volume of requests we can generate. He will be completely out of his depth. Make sure the subpoenas include Malcolm's personal accounts, I added. I want a complete accounting of every dollar he spent while acting as vice president of the logistics firm. The dinners, the trips, the cars, every single cent. Over the next 3 months, the litigation proceeded exactly as I had orchestrated. Marcus and his team of ruthless corporate attorneys unleashed a legal avalanche on Gregory Vance. The discovery phase was a brutal, systematic unearthing of the Addams family's financial ruin. Vance attempted to file motions to limit the scope of discovery, arguing it was invasive and irrelevant to the emotional distress claims, but the judge, a no-nonsense woman with zero tolerance for frivolous lawsuits, denied every single one. My parents had opened the door to their financial history the moment they claimed predatory practices. When the day of the depositions finally arrived, we reserved the largest conference room in my corporate headquarters. The long mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine, and a court reporter sat quietly in the corner setting up her stenography machine. I sat at the head of the table with Marcus to my right. At exactly 9 o'clock, the double doors opened and my parents walked in, accompanied by their thoroughly overwhelmed lawyer. The physical toll of the last few months was striking. The polished, affluent veneer my parents had worn like armor for my entire life was completely gone. Calvin looked shrunken, his suit hanging loosely on his frame. Patricia looked exhausted, her face tight and drawn. They had lost the Atlanta mansion, they had lost their country club status, and now they were being dragged through a humiliating legal process they could not afford. They took their seats across from us, avoiding eye contact. Gregory Vance nervously arranged his legal pads, pulling at his collar as he looked around the opulent boardroom. The deposition of Calvin Addams began first. Marcus was relentless. He did not raise his voice, he simply presented document after document, dissecting Calvin's financial history with lethal precision. He produced the foreclosure notices, the default records, and the signed lease agreement for the Buckhead estate. Mr. Addams, Marcus said, sliding a document across the table. Is this your signature on the commercial lease agreement with Apex Real Estate Holdings dated 4 years ago? Calvin stared at the paper, his jaw tight. Yes. And at the time you signed this lease, were you under any physical or mental duress? Marcus asked. I was desperate, Calvin muttered. We were going to lose the house. But you understood you were signing a rental agreement, Marcus pressed. You understood you were no longer the owner of the property. Yes, Calvin whispered. Marcus then moved to Malcolm's corporate audits, presenting page after page of unauthorized expenses and staggering losses. He forced Calvin to admit under oath that he had secretly sold 80% of the company's equity to avoid bankruptcy because of his son's incompetence. Every question stripped away another layer of my father's false pride. When it was Patricia's turn, the atmosphere in the room grew even colder. Marcus pulled out a file that I had specifically instructed him to gather. It contained the financial records from 15 years ago. The exact timeline of my grandmother's death, the payout of her life insurance policy, and the subsequent massive deposits into Malcolm's college accounts. Mrs. Addams, Marcus said, his voice deadly calm. We have subpoenaed the records regarding the life insurance policy of Dorothy Williams, your late mother. The policy named your daughter Danielle as the primary beneficiary of a $50,000 educational trust. Patricia went completely rigid. She looked at Vance, who appeared entirely confused, clearly having no prior knowledge of this specific history. Can you explain to the court reporter why these funds were never transferred to your daughter and instead correlate exactly with a $50,000 deposit into a joint account held by you and your son Malcolm? Marcus asked. Patricia's breath hitched. She looked at me, her eyes wide with panic. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. She was under oath. Lying now would be perjury. Lying now. Patricia stammered, her hands shaking as she clasped them together on the table. We needed the money for Malcolm's networking. It was an investment in his future. So you acknowledge under oath that you misappropriated funds intended for your daughter's education, Marcus clarified, ensuring the court reporter captured every word. Patricia began to cry, a quiet, defeated weeping that offered no defense. Yes, she whispered. I watched her, feeling a profound sense of closure. The truth was finally on the record. The theft, the favoritism, the absolute disregard for my well-being was no longer a secret burden I had to carry alone. It was a documented legal fact. 2 weeks after the depositions, Gregory Vance contacted Marcus begging for a settlement conference. The bravado of the $10 million lawsuit had completely vanished, replaced by the terrifying realization that they were exposed to massive counterclaims for embezzlement and corporate fraud. We agreed to meet them at a neutral mediator's office downtown. When I entered the room, my parents and their lawyer were already seated. They looked thoroughly beaten. The illusion was dead. There was no more grandstanding, no more demands for respect based on hollow authority. My clients are willing to withdraw the lawsuit with prejudice, Vance said immediately, eager to end his involvement in the disastrous case. We ask that both parties agree to walk away. No countersuits, no further litigation. Marcus looked at me, waiting for my instruction. I sat back in my chair, looking across the table at the people who had brought me into the world, and then spent 3 decades trying to make me feel small. I will agree to drop the counterclaims for corporate fraud against Malcolm, I said, my voice steady and clear. And I will not pursue criminal charges regarding the misappropriated life insurance funds. Relief washed over my parents' faces, visible and immediate. Calvin let out a shaky breath and Patricia closed her eyes. However, I continued, leaning forward, resting my arms on the table. I have one condition. You will sign a legally binding non-disparagement and no-contact agreement. You will never attempt to contact me by phone, email, or through third parties. You will never mention my name in your new social circles. You will never claim any association with me or my companies. If you violate this agreement, the countersuits will be filed immediately. Calvin looked at me, the reality of the complete and permanent severance finally taking hold. He was officially losing his daughter, not because I was rebellious or difficult, but because I had simply outgrown the need for his conditional approval. Danielle, he said, his voice quiet and raspy. Is this really how you want it to end? A legal contract forcing us to stay away. You ended it 15 years ago, Dad, I replied, my tone holding no anger, only an absolute, immovable boundary. I am just finalizing the paperwork. They signed the agreement in silence. The scratching of their pens against the paper was the only sound in the room. When the documents were fully executed and notarized, I stood up, gathering my purse. I did not say goodbye. I did not offer any final words of closure. I simply turned and walked out the door, Marcus following closely behind me. Stepping out of the office building, the afternoon sun warmed my face. The city buzzed around me, a symphony of ambition and movement. I took a deep breath, feeling the absolute lightness of my own existence. The anchor I had dragged behind me for my entire life was finally cut loose. I was entirely my own. And as I walked toward my waiting car, I knew that the empire I had built, the life I had fought so fiercely to secure, was entirely safe. The past was closed. The future belonged only to me. Exactly a month had passed since the day I ordered my family out of my penthouse, and the swift brutality of their eviction from the Buckhead mansion had sent massive shockwaves through their elite social circles. I was sitting in my corner office looking out at the sprawling city skyline and reviewing the final contracts for a new billion-dollar commercial acquisition when my assistant walked in holding a thick stack of legal documents. She looked nervous as she handed them over, explaining that a process server had just dropped them off at the front desk. Calvin and Patricia had actually managed to find a desperate, sleazy lawyer willing to take their case on contingency. They were suing me for elder abuse and emotional distress, and they were demanding $10 million in damages. They wanted to drag me into open court to force a public settlement, hoping I would pay them off just to avoid the media scandal. I looked down at the official summons reading their ridiculous fabricated claims, and I just smiled. Perfect. The Fulton County Courthouse in Atlanta was cold and imposing, with high vaulted ceilings and dark oak paneling that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. I sat at the defense table wearing a sharp-tailored charcoal suit projecting absolute calm. I did not fidget or look around. I just stared straight ahead. Across the aisle, my parents were putting on the performance of a lifetime. Patricia was wearing a faded gray cardigan that she had probably bought at a thrift store just for this occasion, completely abandoning her usual designer brands and expensive jewelry to look frail and victimized. She kept dabbing at her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. Calvin sat next to her with his shoulders slumped, looking like a broken old man who had been terrorized and manipulated by his cruel, wealthy daughter. Their lawyer was a sweaty, red-faced man named Gregory Vance, who paced frantically in front of the judge. He practically yelled as he delivered his opening statement, painting a horrifying picture of me to the court. He called me a greedy, vindictive corporate shark who had maliciously deceived her loving, trusting parents. He claimed I had used my massive wealth and deep understanding of real estate law to orchestrate a hostile takeover of my family home, just to throw them onto the street out of pure spite. He went on a long, dramatic rant about family loyalty and elder exploitation, claiming my parents had sacrificed everything to raise me only to be discarded and left homeless in their twilight years. Patricia let out a loud, theatrical sob right on cue, burying her face in her hands as Vance pointed a trembling finger in my direction. My high-powered legal team, led by my brilliant corporate attorney Marcus, did not even break a sweat. Marcus sat beside me taking methodical notes with a silver pen, completely unbothered by the emotional circus happening across the room. He treated the entire lawsuit like a minor administrative annoyance. When it was our turn to present the defense, Marcus simply stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. We did not rely on emotional appeals or dramatic speeches about family trauma. We brought the receipts. Marcus called me to the stand. I walked up the wooden steps and took the oath, my voice steady and clear, echoing in the silent courtroom. I sat down and adjusted the microphone. Marcus asked me to explain the financial history of the Buckhead estate and the exact nature of the lease agreement. Instead of just telling the story, I reached into the heavy leather folder I had brought with me to the witness stand. I pulled out the original signed lease agreements and the bank foreclosure records. I handed them to the bailiff to present to the judge. I showed the court exactly where Calvin had willingly and knowingly signed over his rights to the house in exchange for a deeply discounted rental rate, so he could avoid the public embarrassment of bankruptcy. His signature was right there in black and white, notarized and legally binding. Vance tried to object, claiming the documents were confusing and that my parents did not understand what they were signing. Marcus calmly produced a chain of emails showing Calvin negotiating the terms of the lease with my holding company, proving he was fully aware that he was becoming a tenant. Calvin sank lower into his chair, his face turning a sickly pale color as his entire narrative of being a confused elderly victim fell apart. Then Marcus shifted the focus to the claim of emotional distress and elder abuse. He asked me about the origins of the hostility in our family and why I had maintained such strict financial boundaries with my parents. I reached into my folder again and pulled out the bank records and the copy of a cashed check from 15 years ago. I explained in a clear clinical tone how Patricia had stolen my grandmother's $50,000 life insurance policy, which was an educational trust meant specifically for my college tuition. I presented the deposit slips showing how that exact amount was moved directly into a joint account for Malcolm to buy a luxury car and fund his fraternity dues while I was forced to sleep in my car and work 3 jobs just to survive. Patricia let out another gasp, but this time it was not theatrical. It was a genuine sound of absolute panic. She covered her face with her hands as the judge scrutinized the financial documents, seeing the undeniable proof of her financial theft against her own teenage daughter. But the absolute final nail in the coffin was the audio evidence. Vance, realizing his case was rapidly disintegrating, tried to argue that despite past financial mistakes, my parents had only ever shown me love and that I was alienating them out of corporate greed. He claimed they desperately wanted a relationship with me, so Marcus calmly requested permission to play a voicemail my mother had left me right before the wedding. The judge granted the request, and the court clerk connected my phone to the audio system. The courtroom went dead silent as Patricia's shrill, snobby voice blasted through the speakers. The recording captured her explicitly stating that I was uninvited from the wedding because my skin was too dark. My presence was too quiet, and I was completely socially unfit to mingle with their elite new in-laws. The audio proved she was terrified I would embarrass the family aesthetic, and she explicitly told me to stay away and hide my face so Malcolm could shine. The entire gallery gasped. Vance closed his eyes and rubbed his temples, realizing his career was essentially over. Calvin stared at the floor, looking like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. Judge Morrison, a no-nonsense African-American woman in her late 50s, leaned back in her high leather chair. She took off her reading glasses and set them down on the heavy wooden desk. Her eyes were blazing with absolute disgust as she looked down at Calvin and Patricia. The silence in the courtroom was terrifying as she shuffled the papers on her desk before delivering her verdict. "You did not raise a daughter, Judge," Morrison said, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "You created a scapegoat. You systematically abused and exploited your own child to fund a lifestyle you clearly could not afford and to coddle a son who refused to work. You stole her educational funds. You mocked her appearance, and you discarded her when she did not fit your superficial country club aesthetic. And now that she has built an incredibly successful life, despite your best efforts to ruin her, you are trying to use this court to extort her because your own financial mismanagement finally caught up with you." Judge Morrison leaned forward, resting her arms on the desk, her glare pinning my parents to their seats. "This lawsuit is not just entirely frivolous. It is a profound insult to this justice system and a complete waste of this court's time. It is nothing more than a desperate, malicious cash grab by 2 people who refuse to accept accountability for their own toxic actions." She picked up her wooden gavel and gripped it tightly. "I am dismissing this case with prejudice," Judge Morrison announced firmly, the words ringing with absolute finality, which means you can never bring these ridiculous claims before a judge ever again. Furthermore, because of the highly malicious and predatory nature of this filing, I am ordering the plaintiffs Calvin and Patricia Adams to pay the defendants' legal fees in their entirety, based on the billing statement submitted by defense counsel that will be exactly $200,000 payable within 30 days. Court is adjourned. She slammed her gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed through the large room. Patricia let out a devastated wail, sliding down in her chair as if all the bones in her body had suddenly dissolved. Calvin buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. They were completely and absolutely bankrupt. They had no house, no money, no social standing, and now they had a massive legal debt hanging over their heads that they could never possibly pay. Their attempt to destroy me had resulted in their ultimate and final ruin. I stood up smoothly, buttoning my jacket and shaking Marcus by the hand. I did not smile or gloat. I just gathered my leather folder and walked toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. As I walked out into the marble hallway, I saw my family standing near the elevators. They were doing the walk of shame. They looked aged, defeated, and completely stripped of their pride. They were shuffling their feet, staring at the floor, unable to look anyone in the eye. The golden child was broke and jobless. The wealthy parents were homeless and buried in legal debt. Their entire fake reality had been burned to the ground. Malcolm was standing slightly apart from them, looking lost and pathetic. His hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked up as I approached, his eyes wide and fearful. I walked right past my parents without giving them a single glance. They did not exist to me anymore. But as I passed my brother, I stopped for a brief second. I did not say a word. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. I dropped it directly into Malcolm's trembling hands. It was a printed job application for an entry-level night shift position at a local fast food restaurant. I turned away, leaving him staring down at the paper in shock, and walked out through the heavy glass doors into the bright, unapologetic Atlanta sun, ready to get back to my real life. Malcolm unfolded the paper with shaking hands as I walked past him toward the heavy glass doors of the courthouse. I did not have to turn around to know exactly what his face looked like when his eyes scanned the bold black letters at the top of the page. It was a standard employment application for a Tier 1 warehouse associate at Apex Logistics, the very supply chain network I had built from the ashes of his epic corporate failure. I paused at the door, pushing it open slightly to let the hot Atlanta sun hit my face, and looked back at him over my shoulder. Since Harper is going to take you to the cleaners in divorce court, and you have absolutely zero assets to your name, I figured I would be generous. I called out, my voice carrying easily across the marble foyer. It is an entry-level position, minimum wage. Third shift. You will be lifting heavy boxes, loading pallets, and answering to a shift manager who is 10 years younger than you. There is no corner office, Malcolm. There is no corporate expense account. And most importantly, there is absolutely no nepotism. You will earn every single dollar with the sweat off your back, just like I did. He crumpled the paper in his fist, his jaw trembling violently as the absolute reality of his future finally crashed down on him. Calvin and Patricia stood a few feet away, watching in mute, horrified silence. They could not save him. They could not buy his way out of this. They could not even save themselves. I slipped through the doors and walked down the wide concrete steps toward the street where my driver was waiting with the door of my black SUV open. I climbed into the cool leather interior and told him to take me back to headquarters. I did not look out the window as we drove away. I was completely and entirely done with them. The descent of the Addams family was spectacular and swift. When the eviction from the Buckhead mansion was finalized a few days later, the banks and creditors descended on them like hungry vultures. The illusion of their massive wealth was fully and violently exposed to the high society circles they had sacrificed their souls to impress. The country club board of directors convened an emergency meeting and immediately revoked their membership, citing unpaid dues and a sudden breach of the moral conduct clause. The pastors at their megachurch, the same men who used to invite them to sit in the velvet-lined front pews, suddenly stopped returning their calls. Patricia found herself completely ostracized from her charity boards and her weekly luncheon groups. The wealthy women she had spent decades gossiping with and trying to impress simply erased her from their contact lists. She was a pariah in the only world she had ever cared about. With my $200,000 legal judgment hanging over their heads and their credit completely destroyed, Calvin and Patricia were forced to move into a tiny, rundown two-bedroom apartment in a noisy neighborhood on the deep outskirts of the city. It was exactly the kind of place Patricia used to lock her car doors when driving past. She now spent her days sitting in a cramped living room, staring at peeling wallpaper, and listening to the sounds of heavy traffic outside, mourning the phantom kingdom she had thrown away. Calvin was forced to take a commission, only job selling cheap life insurance policies over the phone. A brutal and humiliating irony, considering he had stolen my grandmother's policy to fund his own vanity. He looked 20 years older, his proud, arrogant posture replaced by a permanent defeated slump. They had absolutely nothing left but each other and the toxic resentment they had bred. Malcolm actually showed up at my warehouse a week later. Hunger and utter desperation are incredible motivators when the bank accounts hit zero and the credit cards are frozen. The former golden boy, the supposed brilliant heir to the Adams legacy, was given a neon yellow safety vest and a heavy pair of steel-toed boots. He worked the midnight shift sorting massive freight packages and sweeping the dusty concrete loading docks. His soft, manicured hands blistered and calloused within days. For the first time in his pampered, entitled life, he was forced to realize that he possessed absolutely zero real-world skills. His loud charisma could not lift a 50-pound box of inventory. His unearned arrogance could not convince the shift supervisor to give him an extra 15-minute break. He was utterly unremarkable, just another body on the floor grinding out minimum wage to survive. As for Harper, her attempt to flee a sinking ship only landed her in a different ocean of misery. Her father Richard was drowning in the massive debt he had incurred trying to match my parents' fake wealth and fund a wedding he could never afford. His business went under and his remaining assets were seized by aggressive creditors. Harper was forced to move back into his rapidly downsizing life, stripped of her designer bags and her elite status. The grand society wedding she had tried to leverage into a lifetime of effortless luxury had exploded in her face, leaving her with nothing but legal bills and annulment and public humiliation. She was working as a receptionist at a mid-tier real estate firm, a brutal downgrade for a woman who thought she was marrying into a dynasty. While they learned how to survive in the harsh reality they had created for themselves, I focused entirely on building my legacy. A month after the court case, I finalized the acquisition of a massive international logistics competitor, solidifying Apex as a multi-billion-dollar global empire. But wealth alone was never my ultimate goal. Wealth was just a tool, a heavy iron key to unlock the doors that had been slammed in my face for 35 years. On a crisp, beautiful Saturday evening in late October, I returned to the Chateau estate. The sprawling, magnificent venue with its manicured botanical gardens and soaring crystal windows was lit up brilliantly against the dark night sky. It was the exact same venue where Patricia and Calvin had tried to physically banish me from Harper's wedding. But tonight, there were no fake society elites pretending to be royalty. Tonight, the Chateau estate belonged entirely to me. I had rented the entire property for a massive charity gala. I wore a stunning deep emerald green gown that swept the floor as I walked. My natural hair styled exactly how I wanted it, unapologetic and beautiful. I walked through the grand double doors and the room was filled with brilliant, inspiring, and genuine people. I had used a massive portion of my personal wealth to launch the Dorothy Williams Foundation, named in honor of my grandmother. It was a dedicated scholarship and grant fund designed exclusively for young, brilliant, dark-skinned Black women pursuing degrees and careers in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and finance. I created the foundation for the exact girls that society and toxic families tried to push to the side. The girls who were told they were too dark, too quiet, or too different to succeed. The girls who had their college funds stolen or their dreams dismissed because they did not fit a superficial aesthetic. I wanted to ensure that they would never have to sleep in their cars, never have to endure the crushing weight of conditional love, and never have to beg for a seat at a table they were perfectly capable of buying themselves. I was building an army of women who looked just like me, equipped with the financial backing and mentorship they needed to completely dominate their chosen fields. The ballroom buzzed with an electric, powerful energy. There were incredibly successful female CEOs, leading scientific researchers, tech innovators, and dozens of young scholarship recipients whose lives were about to change forever. My best friend and business partner Jordan stood by my side, smiling with immense pride as we watched the room. These were the people who actually mattered. This was the family I had chosen. They did not care about fake social standing or maintaining a flawless country club facade. They cared about intellect, character, and lifting each other up. The catering was exquisite, the music was joyful, and the atmosphere was completely devoid of the suffocating judgment that had poisoned my childhood. I spent the first 2 hours of the gala walking among the tables talking directly with the young women who had received the inaugural grants. I listened to their brilliant ideas, their innovative business plans, and their incredible resilience. One young woman named Aelia told me how she had been working 2 night jobs to fund her software engineering degree because her family refused to support her. I looked her in the eye and told her she would never have to work a night shift again. I saw the tears of relief wash over her face, and I knew in that exact moment that every single struggle I had endured was entirely worth it. I was healing my own inner child by protecting theirs. As the evening reached its peak, the room quieted down, and the event coordinator introduced me to the stage. The applause was deafening, genuine, and warm. I walked up the steps and stepped up to the microphone, looking out over the sea of beautiful, intelligent faces. There was no anxiety in my chest. There was no lingering hurt from the parents who had discarded me or the brother who had tried to steal my light. There was only absolute, profound peace. The heavy anchor of the Addams family expectations had been completely severed, and I was floating. I took a deep breath, taking in the magnificent crystal chandeliers and the vibrant life filling the massive room. I smiled, letting the pure joy of the moment wash over me completely. I spent a lot of my life trying to shrink myself to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. I said, my voice steady and echoing clearly through the grand ballroom. I tried to earn the love and respect of people who were blinded by their own superficiality. They told me I was not enough. They told me my quiet determination was a flaw. They told me my skin was a liability. They wanted me to be small so they could feel big. I paused, looking at a table near the front, where 5 young, brilliant black women were sitting, their eyes shining with hope and fierce determination. But I realized something very important on my journey here. I continued, my tone shifting into something fierce and commanding. When people try to make you feel small, it is usually because they are absolutely terrified of how massive you can become if you ever realize your own strength. They try to put you in a box because they know that if you ever figure out how to break out of it, you will build an empire that casts a shadow over their entire existence. The room was completely silent, hanging on every single word. Do not ever let anyone dictate your value based on their own profound insecurities, I said, sweeping my gaze across the crowd. You are the architects of your own empires. You do not need their validation. You only need your own vision. You do not owe your success to the people who tried to bury you. You owe it to the people who handed you a shovel and helped you dig your way out. And tonight, everyone in this room holds a shovel. We are going to build the future, and we are going to do it on our own terms. The room erupted into a massive standing ovation. People were cheering loudly, raising their glasses, their faces glowing with genuine admiration and respect. They respected me for my mind, my resilience, and my power. They did not respect me for a fake zip code or a leased mansion. They respected the woman I had fought through absolute hell to become. I stood on the stage, bathed in the warm, bright light, listening to the applause and feeling the absolute undeniable truth of my victory. I had not just survived the toxicity of the Addams family. I had completely transcended it. I had broken the cycle of generational trauma and replaced it with a cycle of generational empowerment. I had taken the stones they threw at me and used them to build a fortress where thousands of other women could find sanctuary. I looked at the crowd and let a small, sharp smile touch my lips as the applause finally began to fade. I leaned into the microphone one last time, my heart full and my spirit completely free. They told me I did not belong in their family because I was not fit for their world. I said, my voice dropping to a powerful, resonant pitch that commanded the entire room. They were right. I did not fit in their world because I was too busy buying it. The greatest lesson from this story is that true security comes from absolute independence rather than seeking validation from toxic people. When family treats your worth as conditional, the most powerful response is to silently build an empire they can never touch. Blood does not excuse abuse. Walking away from a destructive environment is never a failure. It is the ultimate victory. By focusing on her own growth, she transformed her deepest pain into untouchable power. Have you ever had to set hard boundaries with toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your story below. Please like and subscribe today.